If you think silence means nothing is there, you've never stood on frozen water at 20 degrees Fahrenheit and heard something calling from beneath it. The wind across northern Alaska carried a sharp, cutting stillness that morning, the kind that makes even seasoned men slow their breathing without realizing it. Sergeant Jake Miller stood at the edge of a half-frozen lake just outside Denali Ridge, his boots pressed into snow that had hardened like stone overnight, each step sounding too loud in a world that otherwise felt muted. Beside him moved Ghost, a German Shepherd K9 with a sable coat dusted in frost, his posture unusually rigid, not from command, but from something deeper, something instinctive. Jake had worked with Ghost for nearly 4 years across mountain rescues, avalanche zones, and cold weather patrols, but he had never seen him like this. The dog stopped suddenly, head angled toward the ice as if listening to a frequency only he could hear. Then it came, faint at first, carried not through the air but through the frozen ground itself, a sound that resembled barking, distorted and distant, as though the ice itself was holding its breath. Jake frowned, lowering himself slightly, gloved hand touching the surface. "You hear that?" he muttered, though he already knew Ghost did. The K9 stepped forward without hesitation, claws scraping against the slick surface, circling a single point as if marking it invisible. The lake had been declared unstable after a late-season freeze shift, the kind of place where no rational patrol should linger, yet here they were, drawn by something that did not belong to logic. Jake activated his radio, but there was no urgency in his voice yet, only caution, controlled and steady. "Control, this is Miller, possible subsurface disturbance near Grid 7, requesting advisory." Static answered him, distant and unconcerned, as if the world beyond the lake was still asleep. Ghost suddenly let out a low, restrained whine, not panic, but recognition, the kind that makes a man's chest tighten before he understands why. Jake stepped closer, scanning the ice, noticing subtle fractures spreading like pale veins beneath the surface. Thin, fragile, almost invisible unless you were looking for life instead of danger. The sound came again, clearer this time, a rhythmic pattern that no longer felt random, and something in Jake's expression changed, a quiet focus replacing routine awareness. He reached for the compact ice axe strapped to his pack, not because he had decided yet, but because his hands already knew what his mind was still processing. Ghost pressed his shoulder against Jake's leg, a grounding weight, as if anchoring him to a decision that had not yet been spoken aloud. The wind picked up slightly, curling across the lake in long, restless waves, and for a brief moment everything felt suspended, like the world itself was waiting for permission to continue. Jake knelt, striking the ice once, then again, listening for response rather than destruction, and beneath the hollow surface there was a shift, subtle but real, like something alive acknowledging contact from above. He paused, breath visible in the freezing air, and looked at Ghost, who was now completely still, eyes locked on the same point as if he had already crossed a boundary Jake had not yet stepped over. Whatever was beneath the ice was not just sound, not just wind trapped in hollow space. It was presence, faint but undeniable, and it was close. Jake exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries decision before action, and tightened his grip on the axe as the lake beneath them seemed to whisper again, softer this time, almost like it was waiting to be answered. The silence over the frozen lake did not break after that first moment of awareness. It deepened, as if the world itself was holding still to listen more carefully. Sergeant Jake Miller remained kneeling at the edge of the ice, one hand resting on the frozen surface, feeling for vibrations that should not exist in a place like this. His breath came slow and measured, each inhale turning into a faint cloud that dissolved instantly in the cold air. Ghost stood beside him without movement now, no longer pacing or circling, but locked in a posture of absolute attention, ears angled forward, eyes fixed on the same unseen point beneath the ice. Jake adjusted his position slightly, scanning the surface more carefully, noticing now that the ice was not uniform. There were faint pressure lines radiating outward in imperfect geometry, like something had shifted below and frozen in place mid-movement. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a distant voice asking for confirmation. But Jake did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he was listening to something that did not come through a radio frequency. The sound returned, softer now, less like barking and more like a broken rhythm of presence, inconsistent but intentional, as if whatever was beneath was responding to their proximity. Ghost lowered his head closer to the ice, nose nearly touching the surface, exhaling slowly, his breath fogging and disappearing into the frost. Jake felt a tension settle in his chest that was not fear in the traditional sense, but recognition of urgency without context, the kind that trained men learn to respect before they understand it. He reached into his pack and pulled out a compact thermal probe, activating it with a quiet click, watching the small screen flicker to life in the cold. The device registered inconsistent readings beneath the ice, pockets of temperature variation that did not align with natural water currents or trapped air pockets. "That is not normal," Jake murmured under his breath, more to himself than to Ghost, whose attention never wavered. The dog suddenly shifted his weight forward and let out a low, steady whine, not frantic, but insistent, like a signal repeating itself until it is acknowledged. Jake stood slowly, stepping back just enough to assess the surrounding ice sheet, expanding his field of view across the frozen expanse, realizing the disturbance was not isolated but part of a broader weakened section. He raised his hand and keyed his radio again, voice now firmer, grounded in decision. "Control, this is Miller. We have confirmed sub-ice anomaly, requesting immediate ground support and emergency extraction equipment, possible entrapment scenario." There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a shift in tone, the kind that signals attention replacing routine. Jake did not wait for further instruction. He unstrapped the compact emergency kit from his pack, placing it carefully on the snow beside him, opening it with deliberate precision. Inside were standard cold environment rescue tools, rope, thermal blanket, ice hooks, and a reinforced hook pole designed for surface breaches. Ghost moved closer, pressing against Jake's side again, as if syncing his position with the unfolding situation, offering silent reinforcement rather than instruction. The wind picked up across the lake, dragging thin layers of snow across the ice like drifting dust, briefly obscuring visibility before settling again. Jake narrowed his eyes and chose a point slightly ahead of the earlier fractures, sensing subtle movement beneath that location, not visible but implied through irregular tension in the ice surface. He placed the hook pole down and pressed his hand against the ice once more, feeling for response, and for a brief second there was nothing, only cold resistance. Then came a faint shift, like something pressing upward from below, not forceful, but persistent, as though testing the boundary between two worlds. Jake exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then adjusted his stance, feet planted firmly in the snow for stability. Ghost let out a soft sound, almost like a warning, but his body remained calm, focused, and grounded. The lake remained quiet except for the wind, yet that quiet now felt different, no longer empty, but waiting. The frozen surface of the lake seemed to respond differently now, no longer just a passive sheet of ice, but something that carried tension beneath it, like a living boundary holding back pressure from below. Sergeant Jake Miller shifted his stance carefully, boots pressing deeper into the snow as he moved closer to the point where the faint disturbances had been strongest. Ghost remained at his side, no longer pacing or scanning, but fully anchored in place, his body angled toward the same invisible focal point beneath the ice. Jake lowered himself again, placing both gloved hands flat against the surface, closing his eyes for a brief moment to eliminate visual distraction, relying only on sensation. The cold radiated upward instantly, biting through layers of insulation, but beneath that cold he felt it again, a subtle irregular pulse, not rhythmic like machinery, but uneven like something alive struggling to be understood. His eyes opened slowly, and he exhaled through his nose, recalibrating focus. The radio on his shoulder crackled once more, the voice on the other end asking for a clearer location, but Jake did not respond immediately, because Ghost had changed. The dog was no longer still in the passive sense, but in the focused sense, every muscle aligned, every breath measured, his gaze locked with an intensity that Jake had only seen in moments where instinct overrides training. Then it happened again, the sound beneath the ice, closer this time, no longer ambiguous. It was faint, but structured, as if responding to their proximity rather than existing independently. Jake slowly stood, taking 2 steps back to widen his field of assessment, scanning the ice sheet with renewed precision. The fractures he had noticed earlier were now more visible, thin branching lines extending outward in a subtle pattern that suggested pressure from below rather than surface failure alone. He raised his hand and keyed his radio again, this time with more urgency. "Control, this is Miller. Confirm visual signs of sub-ice activity expanding across Quadrant 7. Requesting immediate extraction team and thermal cutting equipment. Priority level elevated." The response was immediate acknowledgement, but distant, as if it belonged to another world entirely. Jake turned his attention back to Ghost, who had begun a slow, deliberate pacing motion along the edge of the fractured area, stopping at precise intervals as if triangulating an exact point. The behavior was not random. It was guided, consistent, and unusually confident. Jake followed the dog's movement with his eyes, realizing that Ghost was not reacting to sound alone, but to something beneath the ice that was shifting position. Jake tightened his grip on the ice hook tool and stepped closer to where Ghost had stopped, marking the location in his mind. The ice here looked slightly different, less opaque, with a faint translucence that hinted at instability below. He knelt again and pressed the surface lightly with the tip of the tool, listening for change rather than forcing impact. A soft echo returned from beneath, not loud, but unmistakably present, like a distant response delayed through layers of frozen water. Ghost suddenly lowered his head and let out a single controlled bark, sharp but not aggressive, as if signaling confirmation rather than alarm. Jake paused, then spoke quietly, almost to himself. "There is something down there." The wind across the lake shifted direction, momentarily clearing drifting snow from the surface and revealing more of the fractured pattern, now clearly converging toward a central point. Jake felt a tightening in his chest, not fear, but awareness that time was becoming a factor. He adjusted the grip on his tool, planting his feet more firmly, preparing for controlled intervention rather than observation. Ghost stepped closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Jake's leg again, grounding him with steady presence. The lake remained silent except for wind and breath, but beneath that silence, something continued to respond, faint, persistent, and unmistakably alive. The wind over the frozen lake had grown sharper, cutting across the surface in thin, restless waves that carried loose snow like drifting ash. Sergeant Jake Miller stood motionless for a moment, his eyes locked on the exact point where the ice had shown the strongest response. The world around him felt narrower now, as if the entire landscape had collapsed into that single fractured area. Ghost remained beside him, still and unwavering, but the tension in the dog's posture had deepened into something more precise, no longer uncertainty, but recognition of presence. Jake slowly exhaled, adjusting his grip on the ice hook tool, then stepped forward with deliberate care. Each movement was measured, controlled, mindful of the instability beneath his boots. The radio on his shoulder continued to crackle with distant coordination, but it felt secondary now, like background noise from another reality. He lowered himself again, this time closer to the ice than before, studying the subtle variations in color beneath the frozen surface. There were faint distortions, shadows trapped beneath layers of ice, shifting slightly when viewed from different angles. Ghost moved to his left side, mirroring his position, then suddenly paused, his head tilting downward with focused intensity. Jake followed the dog's gaze and noticed it too, a slight darkening beneath the ice that did not match natural depth or reflection. It was not a clear shape, but an impression, something suspended and partially obscured, as if the ice had preserved a moment rather than a substance. Jake raised the ice hook carefully and tapped once against the surface, producing a dull, muted sound that echoed strangely across the frozen expanse. The response beneath was immediate but subtle, a faint vibration that traveled outward in uneven pulses. Ghost let out a low, controlled sound, not alarmed, but confirming. Jake tightened his jaw, then repositioned himself a few feet to the right where the ice appeared thinner, marked by a web of delicate fractures converging toward a central point. He placed the tool down for a moment and activated a compact thermal scanner, watching the small digital display flicker with inconsistent readings. The temperature variance beneath the surface was irregular, suggesting displacement rather than uniform freezing. Jake spoke quietly into his radio again, voice steady but firm. "Control, this is Miller. Adjustment in location. Anomaly appears centered approximately 12 feet east of initial coordinates. Request confirmation on emergency support arrival time." There was a brief pause, then static acknowledgement, but Jake was already focused elsewhere. Ghost had begun to circle slowly, not erratically, but with purpose, stopping at precise intervals, as if triangulating a signal that only he could perceive. Jake watched closely, realizing that the dog was not reacting to sound alone anymore, but to something consistent beneath the ice, something that held pattern and persistence. The wind shifted again, briefly clearing a section of snow from the surface, and in that moment Jake saw it more clearly, a faint contour beneath the ice, elongated and partially obscured, but undeniably present. His breath slowed instinctively, not from fear, but from concentration. He lowered the ice hook again and pressed it gently against the surface, applying controlled pressure. The ice responded with a subtle crackling tension, not breaking, but communicating stress. Ghost stepped closer, pressing his shoulder against Jake's leg once more, grounding him in silent coordination. Jake paused, scanning the surroundings one more time, then looked down at the exact point Ghost had returned to repeatedly. There was no doubt now that something lay beneath the frozen layer, something that was still alive or had recently been so, and the realization settled heavily in the stillness of the frozen landscape. The frozen lake had become something heavier than silence. It felt like a suspended breath that neither nature nor time was willing to release. Sergeant Jake Miller stood at the edge of the fractured zone, his boots planted firmly in the snow, his focus locked entirely on the unstable sheet of ice beneath him. Ghost remained close, no longer shifting position, but holding a steady stance as if awaiting a signal that only he could interpret. The wind moved across the surface in slow, uneven waves, carrying fine snow that briefly blurred visibility before settling again into stillness. Jake adjusted his grip on the ice hook tool, then slowly lowered himself closer to the surface, studying the subtle changes beneath the frozen layer. The darkened contour he had noticed earlier was still there, faint but persistent, and now it seemed slightly more defined, as if proximity itself was sharpening its presence. He exhaled slowly, then tapped the ice once with controlled force, listening carefully for any variation in response. The sound that returned was not hollow anymore. It carried depth, a delayed resonance that suggested space beneath the surface rather than solid ice alone. Ghost stepped forward at the exact moment Jake paused, his body angled directly toward the same point, ears fully forward, eyes fixed without hesitation. Jake felt the shift immediately, not just in the ice, but in the atmosphere of the moment, as if something beneath had acknowledged their position more clearly than before. He reached for his radio again and spoke in a lower, steadier tone, reporting precise coordinates and requesting immediate thermal breach support, his voice now fully aligned with urgency rather than assessment. There was no longer uncertainty in his actions, only controlled progression. The ice hook tool pressed gently against the surface again, and this time the reaction beneath was more pronounced, a faint but undeniable movement that disrupted the stillness in a way that felt intentional. Jake paused, holding perfectly still, allowing the moment to fully register. Ghost let out a quiet sound, restrained and steady, as if confirming what could not yet be fully seen. The ice beneath them was no longer just fractured, it was responsive, as if something below was maintaining awareness of the world above. Jake slowly shifted his position to the right, aligning himself with the center of the subtle structural distortion he had been tracking. The snow around his boots compressed under his weight, each movement deliberate and minimal. He lowered the thermal scanner once more, watching the fluctuating readings stabilize in a narrow range that suggested concentrated presence beneath the surface rather than scattered anomalies. The display flickered briefly before locking into a consistent reading, and Jake's expression changed slightly, not in shock, but in confirmation. Ghost moved closer again, pressing his shoulder against Jake's leg, grounding him in a physical reminder of shared focus. The wind diminished for a brief moment, and in that sudden quiet, the lake felt closer, as if the distance between surface and depth had shortened. Jake placed the ice hook down carefully and extended his hand toward the surface without striking it, simply hovering above it to sense any subtle change. Beneath his palm, there was a faint vibration, irregular but present, like a response filtered through layers of frozen separation. He withdrew his hand slowly, then looked at Ghost, who had not moved his gaze even once from the same point. Jake straightened slightly, scanning the surrounding ice field, confirming that the disturbance remained centralized and contained. The realization settled in him with clarity. Whatever lay beneath was not dispersed or distant, it was directly below them, held in suspension by layers of ice that were now showing signs of stress beyond natural freezing. He tightened his stance, adjusting his footing once more, preparing for controlled intervention as the environment around him seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The frozen lake no longer felt like a passive landscape. It had become an active boundary between two states of existence, one visible and one hidden beneath layers of ice and silence. Sergeant Jake Miller stood in a controlled stance at the edge of the fractured zone, his breathing steady but deliberate, his attention narrowed entirely on the precise point where every anomaly had converged. Ghost remained beside him, unmoving except for subtle shifts in posture that mirrored the tension building beneath the surface. The wind had eased slightly, but the cold remained absolute, pressing against exposed skin and steel equipment alike, as if reinforcing the isolation of the place. Jake slowly lowered the ice hook tool once again, this time not striking but tracing along the surface with measured pressure, following the faint structural lines he had already identified. Beneath the ice, the irregular vibration returned, more consistent now, forming a pattern that suggested awareness rather than randomness. He paused, holding the tool steady, allowing the sensation to settle into clarity rather than speculation. Ghost suddenly shifted his weight forward, placing one paw slightly ahead, his body angled toward the exact center of the disturbance. Jake noticed the change immediately, recognizing it not as reaction, but confirmation. He adjusted his stance and keyed his radio once more, his voice calm, but fully committed to escalation. "Control, this is Miller, final confirmation of sustained subsurface presence, requesting immediate deployment of thermal cutting unit and emergency extraction support at current coordinates." The response came with urgency now, acknowledging priority status, but it felt distant compared to the immediate reality in front of him. Jake lowered himself again, pressing his hand lightly against the ice without force, feeling for any variation in resistance. The response beneath was subtle but undeniable, a faint rhythmic fluctuation that suggested persistence rather than collapse. It was not random movement, it was continuity, something maintaining presence beneath separation. Ghost leaned closer, his nose hovering just above the ice, exhaling slowly, his breath forming a thin mist that disappeared almost instantly. Jake remained still for a long moment, processing the pattern of signals, the structural weaknesses in the ice, and the consistent responses from below. The environment around them seemed to narrow further, as if the world beyond the lake had faded into irrelevance. He carefully repositioned the ice hook tool and marked a second point along the fracture line, noting the alignment between both zones of activity. The pattern was becoming clearer now, not scattered, but centered, focused beneath a single area of compressed ice. Jake exhaled slowly, then spoke quietly to Ghost without expectation of response, more as grounding than communication. "We are close." The dog did not move, but his presence remained steady and absolute, reinforcing the moment with silent certainty. A sudden shift in wind swept across the lake, briefly revealing the fractured surface in greater clarity, and in that moment Jake saw it again, the faint darkened impression beneath the ice, more defined than before, holding shape against the frozen distortion. He tightened his grip on the tool, then paused, choosing patience over force, allowing the situation to continue revealing itself rather than imposing premature action. The radio issued another confirmation of incoming support, estimated arrival time narrowing, but Jake's attention remained fixed entirely on the lake. Ghost gave a single low sound, restrained and controlled, as if acknowledging the threshold they were approaching. The ice beneath them remained intact, but it was no longer still, and Jake understood with absolute clarity that whatever lay beneath was not only present, but waiting. The frozen landscape had settled into a strange kind of stillness, not peaceful, but expectant, as if the entire lake was holding its breath just beneath the surface of ice and silence. Sergeant Jake Miller remained positioned at the edge of the fractured zone, his stance firm and deliberate, eyes locked on the exact area where all previous anomalies had converged. Ghost stood beside him without movement, yet fully engaged, every muscle aligned in a state of controlled readiness that mirrored Jake's own focus. The wind had weakened further, leaving only a thin, constant whisper that slid across the ice like an unseen current. Jake slowly adjusted his position, stepping half a foot to the left, then stopping completely as he reassessed the subtle structural shifts beneath the surface. The ice hook tool remained in his hand, but he no longer used it for impact, only for precision reference, tracing invisible boundaries that only pattern recognition could reveal. Beneath the ice, the faint, irregular presence persisted, no longer fluctuating randomly, but maintaining a steady and intentional rhythm that suggested continuity rather than instability. Jake exhaled slowly, then lowered himself again, bringing his gaze closer to the surface without touching it. Ghost shifted slightly, aligning himself directly beside Jake's leg, as if anchoring him physically to the exact point of awareness. The radio on Jake's shoulder issued a brief confirmation of inbound support units, but the message felt distant compared to the immediacy of what stood directly beneath them. Jake's attention narrowed further as he studied the faint distortion in the ice, now more defined than before, a subtle shape that resisted full clarity yet refused to disappear. It was not movement in the traditional sense, but presence, sustained and localized, as if something beneath was maintaining a consistent position despite the frozen barrier above. He placed the ice hook tool carefully against the surface, not striking, only applying measured pressure to test response. The ice responded with a soft, delayed tension, like a breath held too long and released through resistance. Ghost let out a low, controlled sound, brief and contained, not alarm, but recognition of confirmation. Jake remained still for several seconds, allowing the environment to settle again into silence before making his next adjustment. He shifted slightly backward, then scanned the surrounding ice field, confirming that all secondary fractures continued to converge toward the same central point. The pattern was now undeniable, structured, intentional, and centered. He tightened his grip on the tool, then paused once more, choosing observation over action, understanding that timing would determine stability more than force. Ghost suddenly lifted his head slightly, ears angled forward, and Jake noticed a subtle change in his posture, as if the dog had detected a shift beneath the surface that had not yet manifested externally. Jake followed Ghost's focus and saw it again, the faint darkened impression beneath the ice, now clearer than before, shaped not by randomness, but by sustained presence in one confined area. The realization settled deeper, not as surprise, but as confirmation of everything the readings had already suggested. He spoke quietly into the radio again, voice calm but firm, providing final location refinement and requesting immediate deployment upon arrival, his tone now fully aligned with operational certainty. The wind briefly returned in a thin sweep across the lake, lifting a layer of powder snow and revealing the fractured geometry beneath with greater clarity. And in that brief exposure, Jake understood that whatever lay below was not dispersing, not fading, but remaining exactly where it had been since first detection. Ghost stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, his body perfectly aligned with the central point of focus, reinforcing what instinct had already confirmed. Jake lowered his hand slowly toward the ice again, stopping just above the surface, feeling a faint vibration rise through the air itself, subtle but consistent, like a message transmitted through layers of separation. He withdrew his hand slowly, then straightened, his eyes never leaving the center of the disturbance. The lake remained frozen, silent, and unmoving on the surface, but beneath that surface, something continued to endure, steady and present, as if waiting for the moment it would no longer need to remain hidden. The frozen lake no longer felt like an empty stretch of northern wilderness. It felt like a sealed chamber, holding something that refused to disappear. Sergeant Jake Miller stood at the edge of the fractured zone, completely still now, his focus sharpened into absolute precision. Ghost remained beside him, equally motionless, yet every part of his body carried the weight of sustained awareness, as if he was maintaining contact with something unseen beneath layers of ice and silence. The wind had almost fully faded, leaving only a thin, intermittent movement across the surface that barely disturbed the snow. Jake's eyes remained locked on the same central point beneath the ice, where the faint impression had grown slightly more defined with time rather than fading. It was no longer just a suggestion of presence, it was continuity, something holding position in defiance of isolation. He adjusted his stance slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile surface beneath his boots, then lowered the ice hook tool to rest lightly against the ice without applying force. The contact created a soft resonance that traveled outward in a delayed ripple, and beneath it, the response returned in a similar pattern, faint but unmistakably consistent. Ghost shifted his weight slightly forward, his ears angling with exact alignment toward the same focal point, reinforcing the precision of their shared attention. Jake exhaled slowly, then lifted his hand, hovering just above the ice, feeling a faint vibration that seemed to rise through the frozen layers rather than travel through them. The sensation was subtle but persistent, like a steady signal transmitted through barriers of cold and pressure. He withdrew his hand carefully and straightened, eyes narrowing as he reassessed the entire surface once more. The structural fractures had not expanded outward, but they had become more coherent, converging with greater clarity toward a single location beneath the surface. Jake keyed his radio again, voice calm but fully controlled, confirming coordinates and requesting immediate arrival of thermal breach equipment, his tone now reflecting final readiness rather than analysis. There was a brief acknowledgement on the other end, but the distance between communication and reality felt wider than before. Ghost suddenly took a slow step forward, then stopped precisely at the edge of the most fragile section of ice, his posture perfectly aligned with the center of disturbance. Jake followed his movement with his eyes and understood that this was no longer about detection, it was about confirmation of presence that refused to disperse. The ice beneath them remained intact, but the impression beneath it had become more stable, as if whatever lay below had adjusted to their proximity rather than reacting to it. Jake crouched again, placing the ice hook tool gently against the surface, tracing a narrow arc that aligned with the deepest point of the anomaly. The contact produced a faint, layered echo, and beneath it came the same irregular response, steady and persistent, no longer ambiguous in its pattern. Ghost let out a quiet sound, restrained and low, then lowered his head closer to the ice without touching it, maintaining a careful distance that mirrored Jake's controlled restraint. The wind briefly returned in a soft sweep across the lake, revealing the fractured lines once more, and in that moment the central distortion appeared slightly darker, more defined, as if the ice itself had grown thinner at that exact point. Jake tightened his grip on the tool, then paused again, choosing stillness over action as the situation reached a point of critical clarity. The radio confirmed that support units were within range, but Jake's attention never left the center of the lake. Ghost remained fixed beside him, perfectly still now, as if both were waiting for the exact moment when silence would no longer be enough to contain what lay beneath. The lake had reached a point of absolute stillness, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness that arrives right before change becomes unavoidable. Sergeant Jake Miller remained at the edge of the fractured ice zone, his entire posture controlled and steady, eyes fixed on the precise point beneath. The surface where all signals of presence had converged. Ghost stood beside him without movement, yet fully engaged, his attention locked with an intensity that mirrored Jake's own focus, as if both were maintaining silent contact with something beneath layers of frozen separation. The wind had nearly vanished now, leaving only a faint pressure across the open lake that barely disturbed the snow resting on the ice. Jake slowly adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly to maintain balance on the unstable surface, then lowered the ice hook tool one final time to hover just above the center point. The faint impression beneath the ice remained, but now it felt closer, more defined, as if whatever lay below had adjusted its position in response to sustained proximity above. Jake exhaled slowly, then paused, holding completely still as he reassessed every detail of the fractured pattern beneath him. The radio on his shoulder issued a final confirmation of incoming support units, their estimated arrival now imminent. But Jake's focus never shifted from the ice itself. Ghost suddenly stepped forward one precise pace, stopping exactly at the edge of the most fragile zone, his body aligned perfectly with the center of the disturbance. Jake followed the movement with his eyes and understood that this was no longer about detection or uncertainty. It was about confirmation of sustained presence that refused to disappear. The ice beneath them showed no expansion of cracks, but the internal structure had changed, becoming more transparent in localized areas where the darkness below pressed closer to the surface. Jake lowered himself carefully once more, placing the ice hook tool against the surface with controlled precision, tracing the exact point where all prior readings had converged. The contact produced a soft, delayed resonance that traveled outward in subtle ripples, and beneath it came a corresponding response, steady and persistent, as if acknowledging contact rather than reacting to it. Ghost lowered his head slowly, bringing his nose close to the surface without touching it, maintaining a careful distance that reflected disciplined restraint. Jake's breathing remained steady, but his awareness had narrowed completely into the moment, every detail of the frozen environment now secondary to the presence beneath. The faint distortion under the ice became more visible in brief intervals as shifting wind cleared thin layers of snow, revealing a shape that resisted full definition but maintained clear continuity. It was not random. It was centered, stable, and enduring, as if suspended in a state between separation and contact. Jake tightened his grip on the ice hook tool, then paused again, choosing absolute stillness as the final approach of support units neared. The sound of distant engines became faintly perceptible across the frozen expanse, a subtle confirmation that time was narrowing. Ghost remained perfectly aligned with the center point, unmoving now, as if holding position on a boundary that could not yet be crossed. Jake slowly lifted his hand and hovered it just above the ice one final time, feeling a faint vibration rise through the surface, steady and consistent, no longer uncertain or fragmented. He withdrew his hand slowly and straightened, eyes never leaving the exact point beneath the ice where presence had been sustained without interruption. The frozen lake remained intact, silent, and unbroken on the surface, but beneath it, something continued to endure, waiting at the threshold of release.